All right, let's get into it. Today, we're jumping into a world where, well, basically anything can think. From a donut to a dinosaur. We're going to unpack this really cool collection of ideas called the philosophical bestiary.
So, let's just start with a question that gets right to the heart of it all, shall we? What if a donut just woke up? What happens when something that simple suddenly becomes conscious?
And yeah, that's literally the first bewildered thought of our newly sentient donut. It's a question that kicks off a really strange journey into what it even means to think.
So you can see this isn't just about talking animals or something simple like that. It's really about the fundamental nuts and bolts of how any mind, no matter how weird, perceives reality.
First up, we're going to look at this bizarre phenomenon, the accidental thinker. You know, that strange, sudden, and often totally unwelcome spark of self-awareness in the most unlikely of places. And get this, it's not always a celebrated event. Take the egg, for instance. From its point of view, consciousness isn't some miracle. It's an exhausting mistake. I mean, what a fascinating perspective, right? This idea that just being alive is a burden that messes up the simple, peaceful life of just being inorganic matter. And this leads us to a really crucial point, which is actually raised by the donut itself. If evolution is all about necessity, what possible need could a donut have for self-awareness? It's a fantastic question, and it completely challenges our whole understanding of why things think. So here's our first big idea. Maybe consciousness isn't always an advantage.
Okay, so now we have these new minds. The next question is, how do they actually see the world? And that brings us to our next section, a flawed reality. Because as it turns out, just because you can think doesn't mean you think clearly. For example, just listen to the dinosaur. Its entire worldview is built on this one simple, super confident, and, well, ultimately flawed idea. Size is everything. The very concept of becoming smaller is just, completely incomprehensible to it. And this isn't just a one-off thing. The pterodactyl shares the exact same confusion, wondering why in the world evolution would ever lead to something smaller. It's this shared blind spot, right? A kind of logic built on very limited experience that feels like absolute, undeniable truth to them. We see it again with the bear, who is just completely baffled by the panda. The fact that they look so similar, but the panda is so gentle, it just doesn't compute. So the bear's mind leaps to the only explanation it can think of. It must be a trick. And this points to something really crucial. Our minds build stories to fill in the gaps when things confuse us.
So, if individual minds have these flawed perceptions, what happens when those perceptions start to get shared? Well, that's what we're going to explore next as we see how a flawed reality can actually build a collective myth. We're going from lizard to legend.
Which brings us to a huge, central question. How does a real creature, like a giant lizard, transform in our collective minds into something totally different, a legend, like a dragon?
And you're not going to believe who gives us the clue. A humble butterfly. And it's a truly brilliant observation. The transformation isn't physical, it's psychological. The dinosaurs didn't actually change. The idea of them shapeshifted into the legend of the dragon, all inside our heads.
So how does this actually happen? Well, the Dove offers a theory. It calls it a psychological template. It's kind of like a pre-existing mold in our collective consciousness. So when a real thing, like a dinosaur, fits that giant, scaly reptile template, our minds can just sort of swap it out for a myth, like a dragon.
So the crucial point here is that these legends are basically byproducts of our own minds. This is the mechanism that turns real animals into these abstract concepts. It's why doves, who are really just living their lives, become symbols of peace. It's why we automatically assume foxes are clever, and it's how giant lizards become fire-breathing dragons in all of our stories. But, what's it actually like for the creatures that get caught up in these myths? In our final section, we're going to explore that burden of being a legend, both for the ones that are mythical and for the ones that are very real.
So, let's hear from the dragon itself. It lives in this strange space, totally aware that its identity isn't really its own. It's something woven together from our collective imagination. It lives as a legend, a creature shaped entirely by how we perceive it.
And then you've got the flip side. The very real dragonfly who is just completely frustrated about being stuck with a mythical name. It has absolutely nothing to do with dragons, yet it's forced to carry the weight of that fantasy in its very name.
And here is the big takeaway from all this. Our mental shortcuts, they have real-world consequences. They create expectations and impose identities, not just on the fantasies we invent, but on the actual creatures living in the world right alongside us. And wow, this is just captured so perfectly by the centaur's question. It's such a piercing question, isn't it? When we create myths for our own entertainment, do we forget that in their own world, these beings are alive? Their existence is more than just a story for us to consume. Which leaves us with this final thought, adapted from the fox. We create these mental shortcuts, these myths, because, let's be honest, they're easy and they're satisfying. But in doing that, are we maybe missing out on the richer, more complex, and more objective truths of the world? It's definitely a question worth thinking about.